CNT120, Chapter 6. We're continuing after the small office home or smaller home office, moving into the corporate network. We're now talking about configuring your Wi-Fi connectivity devices. So APs are going to vary in what they support, strength, features, that sort of thing. As I'm installing access points, or even like home wireless, if you will, some of the variables I set during installation, and these will vary. A lot of times you'll browse into them to set them up. There'll be a default IP address on that you browse into, put some settings on, then change it to what you need it to be. But you obviously set password for getting access to it. Set things like your SSID, whether that's broadcast or not as well. Whether it's going to use DHCP or you're going to rely on something on the network like a DHCP server installed on the network to do DHCP for you. And other security encryption options, whether you're using WPA, WPA2, WPA, WPA2 Personal, WPA2 Enterprise, which we'll talk about in just a minute here. These would all be settings you apply on there. Usually you do kind of like a save and reboot, and then that access point is using those settings for your network. That's typically what's done. So the clients then, once the access point is broadcasting out as SSID, the clients in the vicinity will detect that or sense that and can choose to connect to. We run into a couple terms here, especially in the corporate environment: onboarding, offboarding, and remote wipe. If you're in a corporate environment, a lot of times as a device connects, it actually installs a little program on that is going to make sure it's a trusted device on that network, maybe that corporate network, maybe that laptop that's connecting to the corporate network. So a little application gets installed on there to say, yes, this is a trusted device. I'm making sure nothing on here is going to compromise the security of the network. As that device would need to be removed, offboarding would need to occur, and that would be usually uninstalling that app or that program on that device. If it's a corporate-owned entity, maybe a corporate laptop or something like that, there usually is a feature installed on it to allow it to be remote wiped. Meaning, if it loses connection with the corporate network, you kind of assume it's stolen. So maybe on next boot, it's programmed that it'll wipe itself. It has no longer made contact with the corporate network, so it literally wipes its hard drives to protect the company resources that might be on that device. So these are some terms you run into when dealing with, like corporate Wi-Fi or corporate wireless. So into the security realm, 802.11 standard does not actually have any security by default. The only thing really you can do on the 802.11 end is not broadcast the SSID, which is, it's not really security, but it's a piece of the whole. When we first set up wireless at our church, we were not setting it up for the people coming to the church. We were setting it for the staff. We shut off broadcasting SSID so only the staff knew it was there, and you would literally have to know it's there to be able to connect to it. So average Joe Schmo off the street would not know it's there, so it's the minimal level of security that you could do. Authentication, MAC filtering, and encryption are things that come along with wireless security. Authentication, I need a way to authenticate. This is somebody allowed to be on the network. So the credentials they plug in are checked against something to allow them to be on the network. MAC filtering is something that can be done on most wireless networks, even your home network. You can put a list of MAC addresses that are allowed to be on the network, or you can put a list of MAC addresses out there of devices that have been banned from your network. Sometimes that's done for people that are abusing a policy in place for that facility. That can be done usually on your device. You just put the MAC address in of the device allowed, and then it's permitted to use the network. Encryption, we would need some sort of encryption turned on, so we're at least we're scrambling the data being sent from the device to the access point and back. So people could see the data, but they can't actually read it. I can actually see the data being moved around, but I can't actually read it. So it's keeping our data private, if you will. So that brings us into some of our first privacy, or first security, if you will. WEP, wireless equivalent privacy. 802.11 allows optional encryption using WEP. This was in the late 90s. This was for like 802.11b and A. There was two forms of authentication. It's not secure, but authentication. The open system authentication and the shared key authentication. The open system authentication, the client knows the SSID. Client requests authentication from the access point. Access point generates a single-use key. There's no encryption used. It's really just to getting permission to use the access point. So once I'm connected, you know, it's like all my data is still being sent in clear text. It's not really authentication. The shared key authentication, all the users are using the same key. So we're all using the same key for encryption and etc. So at any point that key could be cracked. You know, if I figure it out for mine, I can try to apply it and crack it for everybody else on there. So again, this is not really secure, not really secure for any kind of communications. This is replaced just a handful of years later by WPA for your 11G standard. So with WPA, this was implemented early 2000s for 11G devices. This is now going to dynamically assign a transmission its own key. So to do that, it was using TKIP, Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. This one is ensuring that the packets are coming from the declared source, packet authentication. The key, again, it's assigning every transmission its own key, and that was provided by the RC4. It's now an insecure encryption cipher, but at that time was much better than the the WEP, the wireless wireless equivalent privacy. I'll get it out yet. My words were not coming to me today. WPA2 was implemented a handful of years later. Again, a stronger encryption protocol. This in trying to improve upon what was there with WPA. Well, this one they were adding the counter mode with CBC MAC, the cipher block chaining and message authentication code protocol. So this was improving the wireless security for newer devices, also helping ensure data confidentiality, encryption, and packet authentication. So this was improving upon that by using AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, more secure than the TKIP that was used previously. A lot of devices are using WPA2 at present. A lot of devices are using WPA2 at present. The Wi-Fi Alliance has released the next generation, WPA3, just a handful of years ago, and some devices are getting certified as WPA3. This one has some features that it's touting. There's still some things that needs to be figured out, but again, it's the next step in securing our wireless transmissions. So as we start talking connections, we run into things like WPA Personal and WPA Enterprise. So let's take a look at these differences, Personal Enterprise. Well, Personal WPA, Personal WPA2 Personal are typically WPA pre-shared key, WPA2 pre-shared key. The pre-shared key stands for, PSK stands for pre-shared key. This is common on your home networks. You enter a passphrase to authenticate. The passphrase and the SSID characters are used to calculate a unique encryption key for each device. So that combination makes that encryption key for that device on that access point much more secure than previous iterations. As we move into the business side of things, we run into WPA Enterprise or WPA2 Enterprise. This now incorporates the use of a radius authentication server. So in addition to WPA or WPA2, we're now using an authentication server to verify. And in enterprise or business environments, that would allow, I'll pick on Doug Brown here, Doug Brown's account on the Radius server to authenticate Doug Brown connecting with his wireless device. Much more secure. The Radius is an open source authentication server. You can gen it up and build it yourself if you will. And that now is your central authentication point for your devices. In this case, our wireless devices connecting in. The Radius server is used in cooperation with authentication mechanism called EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol. It's just a framework for authenticating clients and servers. So it doesn't actually do the encryption authentication. It works in conjunction with. It'll use other encryption authentication schemes, but it's working in conjunction with. And this gives some flexibility for other things that are out there, supporting operating systems, supporting different authentication mechanisms. It's going to do typical network authentication, ID and password, but can also work with biometric methods as well. So as we look here, we have the device connecting to an access point, and then the access point is going to check with the Radius server to authenticate that, Doug Brown is a valid user on the network. So the EAP is that working inside the authentication, helping with this authentication process. So it's working in conjunction with Radius. So then we run in a couple of these terms here: the supplicant, authenticator, and authentication server. Supplicant is your device. Your authenticator is something like your access point that's referencing the Radius server to say, yes, is Doug Brown a real person on here? Is this his password? Yeah, he's allowed on the network. And this shows the communication process between those entities. So EAP is adaptable to newer technology. It was really designed for like point-to-point connections, like WAN users connecting in, if you will. But it's been adapted to work on wired and wireless networks with the 802.1x standard. You'll see that a lot of times when you're working on switches and access points of like, are you using 802.1x standard here? This now allows our traffic over Ethernet, the EAP over Ethernet, if you will. It's just EAP over LAN, Ethernet messages carrying that. So now this can be used across my wired network to deal with my wireless LANs, moving my traffic. As we look back here, back in this picture here, this access point really does need to get connected to a switch and then so forth. So that's going to allow all of that to move through your network. Some adaptations for EAP have been EAP TLS, protected EAP, and fast EAP, EAP fast, if you will. So EAP TLS works very much like HTTPS, the TLS, the SSL TLS part of HTTP. Uses the public key infrastructure in your authentication with your certificate authentication, like we did with HTTPS. It works in that manner. The protected EAP and the EAP fast are tunneling. These are both tunneling. So these are actually tunneling like we would have like IPsec, that kind of thing, using kind of like a faster way to connect and authenticate. And your fast one down here is using things like very similar like cookies in your browser to authenticate these users much quicker. All right, we'll come back in the next section and talk about some additional security.